barreling hurricanes, record flooding, widespread wildfires. When an extreme weather event hits a region, it can result in countless lives lost and billions of dollars in damage. But have you ever wondered what proportion of these disasters can be traced back to climate change? Well, there's an entire field of science dedicated to researching this link.
Attribution science is to answer the question whether and to what extent man-made climate change altered the intensity or the frequency of an extreme weather event to occur.
That's Dr. Friederike Otto, a German climatologist and associate professor in the Global Climate Science program at the University of Oxford in England. She's also the associate director of the Environmental Change Institute at the university and the author of Angry Weather: Heat Waves, Floods, Storms, and the New Science of Climate Change. Because the field of attribution science is relatively new, she says there's been apprehension from people within and outside of science, since weather is always fluctuating.
The one reason why there is a mixed response to what we can say about extreme weather events from a scientific point of view is that before this science was developed, there was the main mantra from climate scientists was either to say we can't attribute individual events, or that, well, we live in a world where climate change is happening, so obviously every extreme weather event is happening in a changed climate, so climate change might play a role. And the latter is trivially true, but it doesn't tell you anything about what role that is, if it makes the event more likely or less likely or much, much more intense. And this is what we now can do with the science of event attribution. We can say how much or how big is the role of climate change in an individual event.
In her line of work, Otto studies the data behind extreme weather patterns across the globe, analyzing the many factors or external drivers that may have influenced the event. To piece together these conclusions, she relies largely on observational data and climate models that simulate major events.
External drivers like the increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere can make an event more likely or more intense to occur, or also less likely and less intense to occur. And that is because there are basically two ways of how climate change affects weather. The first one is what we will call the thermodynamic effect. So you have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That leads to a warmer atmosphere overall. That means that on a global average, you have more heat waves and fewer cold waves. Similarly, a warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor that needs to get out of the atmosphere as rainfall. So also on a global average, we have more extreme rainfall.
Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the data shows an increase in the Earth's temperature. Yet it's a subtle change to the average person. But Otto breaks down that what looks like a small difference on paper has large implications.
When we talk about climate change, we often talk about global mean temperature, and 1 degree global mean temperature change doesn't sound much. And of course, it doesn't kill anyone. It is the changing risks in extreme weather events and sea level rise that comes with these global mean temperature change that kills people and leads to huge losses and damages. You have to think about that in the historic context. So this 1 degree of global mean temperature change that we had over the last century, that has happened incredibly fast compared to every temperature change that has ever happened on this planet before in the last thousands and millions of years.
Otto says that this warming caused by the increased presence of greenhouse gases not only changes the atmospheric composition, but its circulation across the planet. These two effects working together have contributed to many new weather patterns in cities and towns that are ill-equipped to deal with the fallout that comes with more severe conditions.
If you just don't get the type of weather systems anymore that bring in rainfall, so the rainy season has changed, then you will not get any more extreme rainfall, but much less. And because these two effects always work together, but the second effect is very different from place to place and from region to region, we have to look at individual events to figure out what climate change means in the real world where we are actually living.
Otto also makes a point to recognize that not all extreme weather events are worsened or are more prevalent because of climate change. The fact is, it is one factor among a handful of external drivers. But she argues that in some weather events, especially with wildfires, a clear correlation is there.
Heat is one important factor when it comes to fire weather. So fire weather, so the weather that will allow wildfires to spread and be really dangerous, is a combination of high temperatures, low rainfall, and low humidity, but also high winds. And so heat is obviously an important component in that. And so if the other aspects of fire weather are not changing or only changing a little bit, and we have no reason to assume there is no evidence that they are massively changing in other directions, just because of the heat increase because of climate change. Climate change is playing an important role in these wildfires.
Scientists have concluded that climate change is a dominant factor in wildfires. But while it plays a main role, it's important to note that there are also other additional dynamics that add fuel to the fire. This includes a lack of forest management and increased human development in many of these wooded areas. It's no secret that the science behind weather and natural disasters is extremely complex. Even with many scientific studies out there, Otto says that too often, the message around climate change gets lost when communicated to the public, and this ends in inaction on a pressing subject. That's why scientists working within attribution science focus on researching extreme weather events. It's a shared experience that people can relate to and is affecting their communities.
By being able to quantify the role of climate change in extreme weather, we can also quantify what aspects or what amount of the damages is due to climate change. So we can close the causal change from greenhouse gas emissions from individual countries and individual companies to global temperature, to extreme event changes, and to actual damages. So we can say that the heat wave in Argentina that led to huge death tolls in 2015 was made 34% worse because of the emissions of the US. And that, of course, having these numbers, we can then not only use our political power in voting and bringing in policies through that way, but we could also use them through the courts and through climate litigation. So that, I think, is one powerful way of using all the systems and all the tools that we as societies have available to bring change about.
To find out more about the field of attribution science and our guest, Dr. Friederike Otto, visit viewpointsradio.org. You can also check out her book, Angry Weather, Heat Waves, Floods, Storms, and the New Science of Climate Change, available now. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri, studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
So upon first looking at the programs, parents are oftentimes and understandably tricked into believing this is a safe environment, but what goes on beyond those doors is a far different story.
The darker side of inpatient youth rehabilitation. Then,
it was a real struggle for investigators before they were able to team up with forensic scientists.
The birth of the American CSI. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows. And find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.